The line hummed like a living thing. Under the hangar roof, 30 riveters worked in a measured orbit, pneumatic guns stuttering in their hands as metal skins met frames. An oiler in a blue scar overcoat leaned into a crawl space, fingers blackened with grease, and a foreman checked a clipboard as if it could still command the weather outside. June 1943, 1900 hours, Assembly Bay 3. By the clock on the mezzanine, the next complete aircraft would roll free in less than an hour. By the Soviet timetable for that month, the plant was turning out roughly one fighter every 40 minutes during each 18-hour shift cycle. A frantic, practiced rhythm that had begun as improvisation and had hardened into a strategic instrument. If you appreciate detailed looks at wartime industry and how machines shape the front, stay until the end, subscribe, and like for more deep dives into history. Inside that hall, the sound was a constant, layered roar. Presses pounding out bulkheads in a cadence that matched the searchlights beyond the glass, the whine of lathes and drills, the metallic chirp when a rivet snapped to fit, and the distant, muted thud of trucks arriving with sheet metal and wooden crates of instrumentation. The temperature was wet and hot from bodies and engines. A faint tang of cordite lingered from test firings on the small range down the yard. Light from overhead bulbs pooled on the fuselage shells, revealing patches where the enamel had been reapplied and where hurried repairs had left textured fingerprints. Men and women moved in orchestrated passes, measured, almost ritualistic, through stations that had been engineered to shave minutes off the build time without surrendering the aircraft's integrity. The factory called itself, publicly when it had to, simply Plant Number X, and on the maps that men in briefcases carried, it was a node in a larger network. Design bureaus, metal supply yards, test fields, spare parts depots. Behind that clinical name was a wartime organism assembled by dislocation and desire. Entire plants had been hauled east from threatened western cities in 1941. Machine tools, rails relayed, blueprints rolled into oilcloth and driven under military guard. Engineers who had once drafted in calm offices now argued over how best to adapt a design to the realities of improvised jigs and a workforce that included many women drawn from collective farms. A fighter could not be precious. It had to be built quickly, fixed easily, and returned from combat with damage that could be patched without a special tool. The pace, one aircraft every 40 minutes, was not magic. It was the product of three linked decisions that came together in steel and sweat. First, designers accepted simplicity in key structural choices. Panels with straight seams, standard fasteners, and reinforced points where ground fire or hard landings would most likely strike. Second, the plant reorganized around sub-assemblies, wing halves jigs, tailplanes mated on separate bays, engines installed in pre-tested sleds. Third, a logistics chain fed the line, presses timed to blanks, crates of standard bolts arriving on schedule, and a system of patrol inspectors who rejected a casting before it reached the fuselage jig. The result read, unexpectedly, to some foreign observers, as a kind of industrial brute force. To the men who walked the line, it read simply as survival. A pilot's arrival at the factory test field connected those hours of human labor with the war in the sky. The conveyor of work would pass a completed fighter to the test pilots that evening, an armored-skinned, single-seater built to be repaired quickly and to accept a range of power plants and weapon loads. Engines coughed and warmed, propellers whined into the light. A pilot strapped himself into a cockpit that still smelled faintly of lacquer. That cockpit would soon be traversing airspace where fighters dueled and where bombers needed escort. The machine left the factory with tolerance for damage designed into its heart, a thick cowling around an air-cooled radio, accessible control linkages, and a rugged undercarriage built to stand up to hurried returns on rough fields. In the early months of the war, that resilience was a tactical advantage as much as a production one. When a fighter was cheap to repair and abundant to replace, commanders could accept higher sortie rates and riskier missions.
Manufacturing rhythms influenced doctrine. Pilots were trained to expect attrition as an operational norm. They learned to extract every ounce of performance, while engineers and logistic officers worked to reduce the downtime between damage and redeployment. The plant's output mattered not only in numbers, but in the tempo of operations it allowed. Sustained fighter presence above contested ground, continuous support for the front, and the possibility to commit fighters to force multipliers, escorting bombers, covering convoys, or sweeping enemy airfields. The human vignettes were what made the machine more than a number. In a narrow canteen off the main hall sat a riveter named Nina, a composite representative of the thousands of women who kept the Soviet engines turning. Nina had been a peasant from the Volga region. She learned to read blueprints in a wartime rush course and to handle a pneumatic gun with a deftness that made the foreman glance twice. She kept a small icon wrapped in oilcloth in her locker, more habit than piety, and a photograph of a younger brother in a conscript uniform. On nights when the plant ran overtime to meet quotas after an offensively scheduled push, she would tie back her hair, roll up her sleeves, and work until her hands numbed. She never pretended the work was glamorous. In one of her rare interviews after the war, she would later refer to the rows of finished planes as children poured from an oven, a phrase that combined pride with the compressed cruelty of their birth rate. On the flight line, another human account threaded the production story to combat. A young pilot, call him Second Lieutenant Mikhail Sokolov, a fictionalized composite of front flyers, took off in a fresh machine on an afternoon patrol. His radio crackled with the staccato of command. Engines from his squadron climbed through scattered cumulus. Earth below glowed with the patchwork of fields and burned towns. When they met enemy fighters, the engagement was a matter of split seconds. Mikhail found himself diving and climbing in a sequence that blurred the horizon. In the melee, his aircraft's right wing took a burst aft of the leading edge. Metal peeled and a control cable frayed. Instead of catastrophic failure, the structure shuddered, alarms danced in his panel, and the radial engine coughed but kept turning. He managed his way back to friendly ground, wheels scraping gravel as he set down on a compromised strip, and walked away from a craft that, the ground crews would report, had the firewall buckled and 3 skin panels torn. The quick patch, the replacement of a control cable, and a rebalance of the aileron were all tasks the plant's design and maintenance norms anticipated. Within days, another identical aircraft took his place in the squadron. That exchange, pilot to plane to repair to redeployment, was the loop that shaped strategic outcomes. Where some air forces operated with scarcity and expected every sortie to be precious, the Soviet approach increasingly adopted an industrial tempo mentality. Sorties were not isolated acts of heroism, but pulses in an operational heartbeat sustained by production. The tactical logic followed. On days when the Red Army launched localized offensives, commanding officers could call for fighter concentrations above the assault right, knowing that the supporting wings would not vanish after a single engagement. The factory's interior also revealed the politics of production. Decisions made at the design bureau had to pass through a series of practical filters. Raw material shortages, shifting front requirements, and the party's demands for quotas and patriotic language. At a table near the drafting room, a design engineer argued with a commissar over whether a proposed armored plate could be thickened without knocking the production schedule off rhythm. The engineer pleaded the case for survivability. The commissar, reading dispatches of men stranded awaiting air cover, reminded him that more aircraft in the air mattered as much as one more plate on the nose. The compromise was imperfect. Armor where the pilot sat and over the oil tank, simplified canopy framing, and a redesign of the cowling that allowed quicker engine changes. Each concession was a technical calculation measured against the political urgency of getting machines to the front. Tactics evolved alongside these production-driven design choices. Early in the war, doctrinal disagreements about how to employ fighters, escort, air superiority, or close support, were heated. The characteristics of the aircraft influenced tactical adaptation. A fighter with a rugged radial engine and good roll response at moderate altitudes favored aggressive low-altitude engagements and ground support work. Lighter, high-altitude machines favored long, sweeping escorts for bomber formations. Commanders observed results and adjusted. In time, the factories supplied aircraft suited not to a single romantic ideal of air combat, but to a pragmatic set.
Rolls at the front required interceptors to blunt sorties over cities, rugged fighters to protect ground forces, and durable single-seat designs that could, if necessary, absorb battle damage and still limp home. The manufacturing floor itself was a tactical exercise in error control. Subassemblies were tried and retested under simulated combat stresses. Panels were intentionally battered against jigs to see where cracks formed. Engines were stripped and reassembled on mock benches to find the quickest maintenance sequence. Quality control teams, men who had been machinists before the war, stood at stations like sentries of the plane's future life. When a crankcase casting developed porosity, it was removed and studied. The flaw might indicate a supplier problem upstream. The requirement to maintain a constant output of a fighter every 40 minutes was not merely a production target. It was a discipline that forced a factory to institutionalize feedback loops between frontline needs and the metal on the bench. Beyond the plant gates, the logistical demands multiplied. A fighter fresh from the assembly bay relied on a supply chain to deliver it entire to a squadron. Spare propellers, belts, replacement gaskets, ammunition stores, fuel drums, test instruments, and trained technicians who could make field repairs. Refrigeration cars, rail priorities, and the diversion of other goods to make room for aircraft consignments all mattered. Railway marshals scheduled prioritized trains. Wartime improvisation painted stripes on wagons, and teams reconfigured freight yards for an influx of avionics cranes. Every minute shaved from build time could be swallowed by delay in transport if rails were jammed or paratroops struck a bridge. Industry and front fed one another in more intimate ways as well. The plant's supervisory cadre received monthly reports from the front on how certain parts held up under fire. Ground crews described one failure mode. Pilots reported another. Engineers took these empirical notes and sent back change orders. Sometimes these were incremental, an extra stiffener here, a new gasket there. Other times they were radical, the redesign of cowling flaps, the addition of a self-sealing tank modification, a reinforced undercarriage for rough field operations. These changes demanded rapid introduction into the line, and that is where the factory's organizational ingenuity was crucial. Jigs were modified overnight, work cards reprinted, and training shifts reallocated. The plant became a habit of adaptation, its assembly tempo a condition for the front's flexibility. Not every innovation sprouted from the plant's floor. Some came from the test pilots who put aircraft through extremes and returned with technical descriptions so vivid they read like blueprints. Engine surged at -G, or aileron stiff above 400 kilometers per hour. Phrases that design offices translated into modification orders. The test field itself became a crucible where human judgment and mechanical limits met. The pilot who reported that a rudder flutter could be felt as a buzzing through the feet saved a squadron from a catastrophic failure. The fix meant a few minutes of added labor on the line and a revision of operational envelopes. All the while, plant's workers and managers lived under a political fog. Propaganda posters insisted on heroic output. Within the lines, quotas read like threats. Fail a quota and you risked severe reprimand, even removal. Exceed it, and a portrait of the party leader might be pinned on the wall for a week. The emotional texture of the hall was thus braided. Pride in producing a machine that might protect comrades at the front. Fear of the penalties of underproduction, and fatigue from the unremitting pace. Yet, in those pressures, some discovered a sense of purpose. Where fields had once offered barley and repetition, the factory offered a visible, measurable contribution to survival. A fuselage joined today, carried by morning convoys to a unit that might be holding the line. The climax of this industrial effort was not a single dramatic day, but a sequence of operational turning points where saturation and persistence paid tactical dividends. Concentrations of fighters above contested zones, sustained over weeks rather than bursts, blunted enemy air assaults and allowed ground forces to exploit windows of tactical superiority. The ability to commit large numbers of fighters repeatedly mattered more than the instantaneous brilliance of any single ace. The plant's capacity to regenerate losses, make them routine losses, transformed enemy calculations. Opponents found that reducing numbers at one sector produced immediate replacement. Attrition that worked elsewhere did not produce the expected strategic effect. The machine of production had, in effect, weaponized continuity. Yet, continuity had a cost. The epilogue of the factory story carried both accomplishment and sorrow. For every aircraft that left the line and took its turn in the sky, there were returned machines too damaged to mend, pilots who did not come back to sign the work orders, and the choral of burned villages whose smoke chimed with the furnaces. The factory's rhythm, one fighter every 40 minutes, was, in wartime terms, a pulse that sustained operations but also marked the circulation of loss. Men and women who kept the line alive did so with the knowledge that the product of their hands would take lives as well as save them. When the front quieted and peacetime returned, the stories of that haul shifted tone. The technical achievements were cataloged. Methods of rapid assembly, the practice of modular subassemblies, the use of women in highly skilled machine roles all became subjects of study in post-war industrial development. The machines themselves entered museums or were scrapped for peacetime steel. Survivors, foremen, riveters, test pilots told their tales in measured voices, as if unwilling to swell pride beyond the memory of those who had not returned. Their accounts painted the factory as both a crucible of innovation and a mirror of the human costs of total war. But the core annelid truth persisted. An industrial system that could reliably output fighters at a tempo of one every 40 minutes altered the operational landscape. It was not merely the number of airframes that mattered, nor the design choices alone. It was the feedback loop. Designers accepting pragmatic features, factories engineering to tempo, supply lines organized to the plant's cadence, and commanders shaping doctrine to exploit the resulting availability of aircraft. The plane was a node, the network made it a weapon. Outside the plant in the quiet hours, men would sometimes stand on the freight platform and watch a train vanish into the dusk, the silhouettes of crated aircraft like sleeping animals. They counted rivets, not as a habit of production, but as a measure of their contribution. In a sense, this was the factory's lasting legacy, a testimony to how mass technical effort, through choices in steel, time, and human labor, could steer the course of battle, and how ordinary people, caught in the momentum of historical necessity, became the hands that willed those outcomes. At dawn, the yard took on a color that was neither morning nor night, but an alloy of both. Steam rose from the locomotive's vents in thin, deliberate breaths, and the crate stacks threw long, fingered shadows across the cobbles. Workers who had slept in shifts still came to sit along the platform edge, cleaning the dried oil from their nails with the back of a hand, and letting the movement of the freight trains measure something that nothing else would: time remade into distance. They spoke in the low rhythms of habit: who had watched the stars that night, who had been given leave, which squadron had been posted to the south. But even the talk was a way to air out the weight they carried, the forms of loss that could not be documented on the logbooks. Inside, the hall remembered them. Machines that had once hummed in relentless, almost cheerful cadence now ticked with an easier purpose. The long benches where men and women had stood shoulder to shoulder were repurposed, their jigs and fixtures adapted for peacetime goods. Yet there were places where the mark of war remained: a single test rig retooled to measure engine performance, an archive cabinet of brittle blueprints, a series of ragged hangar doors whose hinges still needed the same careful oiling.
The building's bones retained a memory of urgency. Dust settled differently in the corners where nobody thought to sweep. Mikhail, who had been a foreman before the front called him to other duties, and who had come back to supervise the transition, walked among the bays with the gait of someone checking pulse. He had learned the language of tempo better than most, how to read the cadence of a belt, the silence that presaged a tool's failure, the way a foreman's glance could reset a nervous hand. In his pocket, he still carried a tally book, not because reporting required it now, but because habit required rhythm. He would open it sometimes and find a penciled note, 41, 43, 40, marks that once measured output and now measured memory. Lena, whose hands had become famous in the plant for their steadiness at the pneumatic riveter, sat by a window and watched a class of apprentices take their first tentative
practice on an aluminum panel. During the war, she had taught herself new ways to hold the gun so that the shock traveled up through the arm in controlled pulses and did not jar the shoulder into fatigue. She had taught other women in the night shifts, leaning over their shoulders, correcting a wrist, praising a line. Once, at the height of production, she had been given a medal, a small brass thing with a ribbon, and she had refused to pin it to her shirt. "It's not mine alone," she told the man who pressed it upon her. "We all tightened the same bolts." In peacetime, her hands moved with the same care, but for different things: a child's tricycle handle, a public bench hinge, a stove door. The riveter's rhythm became craft. Not all transitions were graceful. Petrov, the test pilot, who had lived the thin exhilaration of pushing a fresh airframe into the fold of sky, stayed longer than most had expected. He had been a young ace, merciless in practice and merciless to himself. He read maps in the same way others read scripture. After the armistice, he took a workshop job maintaining prototypes of civilian aircraft that would, if all went well, ferry mail and medicine. He found that his hands missed the weight of combat decisions. He dreamed, with the inexorable cruelty of those who had to return, of cockpits with empty seats. Sometimes he would visit the scrapyards where returned fuselages lay like the carcasses of large birds, and run his fingers along a rivet row as if checking a pulse. Across the design rooms, Pavel, the engineer credited with the modular approach that had allowed subassemblies to be built in parallel, sat at a table littered with notebooks. He had always been a man of diagrams, boxes within boxes, arrows that indicated flow. Under wartime pressure, he had learned to make compromises that were elegant in their practicality. He designed access panels that could be fitted by unskilled hands, struts that did not require a specialist to align, control linkages that used a common bearing across different airframe models. Those choices had been controversial. At a meeting in the factory's early months, the doctrinaire-men had accused him of sacrificing purity for throughput. He answered with a sketch and a promise that might be read as a confession. "If the enemy can destroy our purity, better that our people can fly." In peace, he turned the same mind toward civilian work, reimagining the assembly techniques for tractors, for grain presses, for municipal water pumps, and found, with an uneasy satisfaction, that tempo could rebuild life as well as arm it. The plant's managerial apparatus, too, changed its language after the guns fell silent. Where once the party's inspectors came with lists and slogans, now committees came with budget sheets and directives about retraining. The rhetoric softened, but the habits of oversight did not vanish. The same people who had hung portraits to curry favor now argued over apprenticeship quotas and machinery depreciation schedules. There was no single conspiracy to convert war machines into peace machines, nor any neat moral absolution. The conversion was messy, partisan, and necessary. Men argued about what to preserve and what to scrap, hold the production line as a strategic reserve, or dismantle it to avoid the temptations of a resumed conflict. And those debates left small scars on community trust. Sabotage, which had been an ever-present specter during the conflict, left its own imprint. A handful of incidents, bolts loosened on night shifts, the deliberate mislabeling of components, had caused catastrophe earlier in the war and had prompted harsh reprisals. Afterward, as the states sought reconciliation, many of the punitive responses were re-examined.
Some acts of sabotage were revealed to be the desperate work of people whose families had starved when rations were curtailed. Others were the work of underground cells who could not reconcile with the regime's demands. The plant cataloged these events, not to bury them, but to understand how fear and scarcity bend human choices. The measures taken, improved safety, more transparent grievance procedures, better ration distribution, did not erase memory, but they softened its sharpest angles. Beyond human choices, the geography of logistics had been reconstituted. Routes that once channeled fuselage crates to the front were repurposed to bring coal to winter markets and to carry harvest to cities. Warehouses that had been stocked with spare parts now contained sewing machines and municipal piping. In small towns along the rail, the presence of the plant continued to shape rhythms. A railwayman whose young son had once waved goodbye to a crate-laden freight car now tended the station's roses, but still wore a cap marked with grease from years of coupling cars. The line between civilian and military uses never wholly vanished. Infrastructure is stubborn, and its ghosts remain. Strategically, the lessons rippled beyond the factory's walls. Commanders who had learned to depend on a high cadence of fighters found that their doctrines, tactics, rotations, reserve structures could be exported to other branches. The Army's logistics corps studied the plant's supply chains, searching for the same reliability. Doctrine became less about daring maneuvers by solitary virtuosos and more about preserving system integrity. Rotate units before fatigue undermined cohesion. Ensure replacement parts moved on schedule. Accept a degree of standardization that made maintenance predictable. That acceptance shaped the temperament of leaders. Long views, an engineering patience, an expectation that time and continuity could defeat sudden brilliance. Opponents, meanwhile, adapted. They found that targeting individual squadrons produced less effect than attacking the lines that fed them. There were attempts to interdict rail hubs and to bombard assembly yards from afar. There were small raids aimed at espionage and at inserting defects before the fuselage boards were sealed. Camouflage and dispersal became countermeasures. Production lines learned to split across cities, to conceal certain key processes in mundane factories, to rotate staff to avoid concentrated vulnerability. The industrial network, once a single artery, became a lattice with redundancies. The plant's original success
thus seeded a broader evolution, an arms race of tempo. The moral side of the machine refused tidy verdicts. In the late afternoons, when the sun poured gold through the skylights and the assembly benches threw long shadows, men and women would pause and tell each other stories of a child who had waved from a train, of a neighbor who had not returned. The telling was not always about blame. Sometimes it was about naming a life, recognizing the contour of another's sacrifice. Many workers who had learned trades during the war used their skills to build community in the years after. A group of women who had learned welding opened a cooperative to repair household goods. The plant became, in small ways, a school. The habits of discipline taught on the line translated to civic organizations, to committees that rebuilt wells, and to councils that planned local markets. Memory turned also to ritual. On the anniversary of the armistice, the plant would not throw parades in the old propagandistic way, but families gathered at the factory gate to leave a single sprig of wild wheat at a small memorial plaque. The plaque was unadorned. Names, dates, and acknowledgement of service. Those who had lost children, lovers, siblings pressed their hands against the cold metal and tried to imagine the sense of someone else's hands shaping the country. The rituals were private and communal at once. They acknowledged the national story without claiming that the wound had closed. Technologies born of necessity found curious afterlives. The practice of modular assembly, once defended as a wartime expedient, informed the early designs of household appliances and vehicles. The same jigs that had ensured fuselage tolerances were adapted to manufacture hospital beds, irrigation pumps, and components for rail cars. Institutes of industry studied the plant's wartime manuals and published white papers on production resilience, a phrase that carried both hope and a faint echo of mobilization.
Some engineers, uncomfortable with the translation, argued for strict demilitarization in design, products that could not be easily remade for war. Others said that knowledge, like steel, could not be unwelded. It would shape whatever society chose to build. A younger generation, those who had been infants during the war, grew up with differing narratives. To some, the factory was a place of inherited pride, proof that ordinary hands could hold history. To others, it was the origin of difficult truths. The price exacted in silence, the social burdens that lingered in widowed households, the ways in which industrial labor had been used as a lever in politics. Schools included visits to the factory museum in their curricula. Teachers told the story of technique and sacrifice, and the children, curious, would place small fingers on polished aluminum and ask what it meant to be brave. As peace matured, the question of commemoration deepened into debate. Should the machines themselves be preserved in stone and glass, or should the focus be the people? Exhibitions curated planes with placards describing production numbers and
design improvements, but surviving workers argued for rooms dedicated to stories, letters, ration cards, poems scribbled on the back of packing lists. The museum acquiesced, and the halls came to hold both metal and flesh. A wing of engines glinting under lights, a neighboring room dim and quiet where a single sewing machine and a nameplate suggested a life once oriented around survival. One autumn evening, when the air carried the smell of cooling metal and wood smoke from the nearby houses, Mikhail and Lena stood together on the freight platform and watched a train roll away, not toward the front, but toward a neighboring town carrying municipal equipment. The crate's silhouettes were no longer predatory, but purposeful in a different register. They counted rivets out of habit, Lena to see if the rhythm matched the practice she had taught, Mikhail to check if the assembly's integrity held. But their counting had changed its valence. It was not merely a measure of contribution to war, but a gauge of continuity, things made to last, to serve. They spoke in soft, practical sentences, arrangements about apprentices, the need to catalog certain jigs for the new municipal orders. Yet beneath the mundane lay the deeper negotiation of memory. Neither sought to sanctify what had been done, nor to deny the grief. They had both learned to hold complexity the way a craftsman holds a fragile fitting, with deliberate pressure, enough to join, but not so much as to break. Farther down the line, in a narrow office lined with shelves of manuals, Pavel still sketched. He drew variants of the same idea he had defended in wartime, a simple bracket, a bearing standard. But now his arrows pointed not to the map of supply to the front, but to a map of supply to schools, to hospitals, to regional workshops. He had not renounced all that had been made. He had only redirected his tools. In that small reorientation lay a truth the factory taught again and again, that human devices were indifferent to intention until intention was set within them. The riveted seams could join machinery for war or for healing. The distinction depended upon the hands and minds that chose the purpose. Outside, the town settled into the modest pleasures of peace. Children played among the old shell casings that had been cleared from nearby fields. A woman reconditioned a delivery van once used to haul fuel. Men met at the cafe and argued about the best way to mend a torn conveyor belt. The factory's echo persisted, not as a single chorus, but as a polyphony. Voices that remembered, voices that retooled, voices that mourned. The machine had taught them to trust rhythm. In the years to come, that lesson would be taken up by planners, and not always in ways the original makers foresaw. But for now, the lesson lived in more humble things. A well-coordinated bakery that could feed a street. A tram line that arrived on schedule. The steady hand of a riveter who now fixed a mother stroller. The continuity that had once multiplied the destructive potential of aircraft was repurposed as a bomb, proof that systems, once learned, could be made to heal. And still the platform kept its watch. Train after train passed. Hands counted rivets, and then, as if testing a different muscle, counted something else. Years lived, children raised, friendships kept. The numbers had lost none of their austerity, but they had found new meanings. In the echo of metal and the slow change of seasons, the factory's legacy unfolded not as a single narrative of triumph or tragedy, but as a braided history. Technical acumen and moral reckoning, innovation and cost, survival and the slow art of rebuilding. The evening closed soft and indeterminate. A group of young apprentices left the plant with their tools slung over their shoulders, laughing at something a foreman had said. An old test pilot walked alone toward the river, his breath fogging in the cool air. The lights in the hall hummed as they always had, but now they illuminated workbenches whose purpose had shifted. The machines, the people, the town, they moved on together, their motions a careful choreography learned in harsh times and adapted to a piece that still required tending. The story of the factory, like the rivets that held its planes together, held in its seams the proof that no technological feat is merely a device. It is a set of relationships, an economy of choices, and a responsibility to what follows. Dawn came like a thin coin of light, and with it the factory's teeth began to stir. Doors creaked, kettles hummed in the yard, and the apprentices who had laughed the night before returned with faces less bright and sleeves already smudged. Mikhail was at his bench before the first whistle. He ran his hand along the same row of fittings he had checked the night before, feeling how the metal had cooled and settled. It had the weight of decisions now, not only of things. Lena arrived with a basket of bread and jars of preserves. She set them down on the long table where the men paused between tasks, and for a moment the shop smelled like home rather than industry. She moved among them in that practiced way she had learned in quieter years, measuring needs with a glance, distributing slices, asking after mothers and sons. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the soft authority of someone who had both given orders and tended small wounds, a burned palm, a broken spring, a shaken apprentice who could not sleep. Pavel passed between benches holding a roll of paper. His drawings had multiplied into a small library, brackets for school stoves, fixtures for water pumps, templates for wheel bearings that would go into children's carriages and into municipal carts. He unrolled one before the foreman, Nikifor, who squinted and frowned, and then softened as if recognizing a math problem whose answer might change a family's life. "We can make the castings from the old molds," Pavel said. "We will use the surplus rivet stock for housings. The motor assembly can be simplified. If we lose the second stage, it will still grind. And if we pair the feed to hoof power, we won't need the carburetor." Nikifor cut him off with a barking laugh. "You always turn our work into a sermon, Pavel. But good. Keep it simple, keep it strong, and write down the parts. If the town wants this, they will have to buy the iron. We'll bargain for blocks, not for planes." There, in a sentence blunt and practical, lay the new economy of the place. Not the projection of steel into the sky, but the careful negotiation of metal into daily life. Men who had once aligned tolerances to 1/1000th of an inch now learned to think in terms of warmth, of dry floors, of pumps that would not fail when winter came. Their skills were the same. The metric had changed. The first test came sooner than anyone expected. A delegation from the Eastern District arrived on a morning train smelling of river mud and peppered with the talk of far fields. They were not soldiers. They were teachers and a midwife and an elder from a cooperative who had gathered funds to buy a small grain mill. They had heard that the factory could put metal to any purpose. Hearing that the factory would consider civilian projects, they had come with sketches crumpled in their pockets and a small, urgent hope. Standing at the platform, the midwife, a woman with hair braided into a single rope and hands calloused from carrying pails, unfolded her plan for a sterilizer that could be heated by a wood fire, a closed vessel to kill infection where there had been too much death.
The teachers wanted a lathe that would allow a small vocational class to learn turning and shaping. With it, they said, the next generation might not need to leave the town for work. Their eyes were steady, the way of people who had waited long enough to know what a reasonable request looked like. Inside, a hard conversation began. There were men who remembered the way plans had been drafted for a different purpose, and they read every petition for utility as a possible re-weaponization. They argued, quiet at first, then more heatedly, about secrecy and access. Nikifor insisted on archives being guarded. We cannot let whatever we have be taken and made into what it once was, he said. Pavel, whose fingers always found a different edge to a problem, proposed cataloging and redacting. Keep the general dimensions, make templates for civilian use, seal the drawings that could be twisted. Mikhail listened more than he spoke. He had been a man who, in another life, could count out the tensile strength of mating pins without looking. Now he did the arithmetic of trust. He saw, in the faces around the table, not only practical risk, but the
old scars that made men protective. There was grief folded into the fear, grief that what they had made could be remembered only in its worst use, grief that their names might be recorded in the register of destruction. Lena, in a voice that moved the argument like a seamstress moving a stubborn hem, said, "We decide together what can be open and what stays closed, but we do not decide to keep everything hidden because some might abuse it. That is cowardice. We learned how to rivet together because someone taught us. We can teach how to rivet together a water pump or a crib or a stove. Do we trust them to use it for life, or do we erase the possibility?" Her words did not end the debate. They shifted its axis. The foremen and elders formed a committee, small, cross-checked, charged with the task of translating war designs into peacetime instruments where possible, and, where not, burning the pages with hands that would remember the gesture. That night, a small bonfire burned in the yard, fed not with exhaustion, but with intention. Some blueprints folded and fed to flames that licked, and, in that combustion, the men felt a measure of catharsis. They watched the smoke and named the things they would not recreate. Not every relic could be burned. There were machines too large, shafts too immense to destroy without enormous expenditure. Those would be converted in place, turrets repurposed into presses, engines reworked into pumps. There was a practical cruelty to the work. The machines did not shape themselves by virtue of desire. People had to take them apart, change their heart, and then set their parts toward new rhythms. The old test pilot, Semyon, who had walked alone to the river, returned one afternoon with a small lacquered box under his arm. He opened it in the break room and revealed a set of model planes he had carved long before the war, each one finished with the obsessive tenderness of a man who had once loved such things for their grace rather than their capacity to hurt. He offered them to a quiet boy named Kolya, an apprentice who had kept to himself and practiced tapping rivets in the corners of the shop. "Take them," Semyon said. "They are mine to give. Keep them. Let them fly in your head, not in the air." Kolya took the models with hands that trembled. That night, at the boarding house where several apprentices lodged, he placed them on a shelf above his bunk and, by lamplight, learned to name the parts: wing, fuselage, tail, and then, hesitantly, purpose. The models became small talismans against a memory that might try to simplify everything into a single judgment. For Kolya, the planes were like old songs. They held beauty and warning, and both were true at once. As spring pushed toward summer, the factory's output shifted in a steady choreography. A line that once produced propellers now rolled out water pumps with a crude elegance. Another produced the gears for communal mills. The municipal orders, those trains carrying cranes and street lamps, became familiar and, to some, a source of quiet pride. Men who had once measured victory in sorties learned to measure it in the number of rooms warmed in a district, the hours of light added to an evening school, the tons of grain milled. There were moments when the town could not avoid the past. A letter arrived from a distant command, asking for parts that might be used in ways the factory now deemed repugnant. The foreman debated whether to send an equivocal load and risk complicity, or to refuse and face retribution from authorities whose power had not entirely diminished. The question split households and friendships. It forced people to practice a kind of courage that was not heroic in the old sense, but bracing and civic, to decline profit in favor of conscience, to accept short-term loss for a longer moral survival. Mikhail, remembering nights in which choices had been made in the dark, urged caution and clarity. He proposed that any external request be routed through the town's elders and the midwife and teachers cooperative, a civilian council whose deliberations would be open. Transparency, he argued, would be the town's defense against both coercion and secrecy. It was a dangerous suggestion. Transparency could anger those who preferred quiet obedience to power. Yet it also offered a way to make the factory porous to the town it had long dominated. The council met in the hall by the river, where the windows caught light and the acoustics expected debate. People came not as emissaries of an abstract state, but as mothers, as shopkeepers, as a schoolmaster who had kept his curtains closed during the worst years and now wanted to reopen his classroom. The proposals were pragmatic: a registry of outgoing parts, a publicly recorded ledger for transactions, an oath sworn by signatory names that the pieces would be used for life-maintaining work only. Not all were convinced. There were men who said that the ledger would be a pretense, that those who desired harm had ways to break a signature. There were others who feared retribution from external power, who called for a low profile. But the council, through slow argument, found a compromise. An oath, yes, but enforced through community checks. Inspections by midwives and teachers who would confirm installations in place. By a rotating committee of apprentices and elders who would visit sites. The mechanism was imperfect. It was also human, and therefore, perhaps, repairable. In the evenings, when the presses had cooled and lamps burned over public tables, people told different kinds of stories. Where once the conversation had been all about the efficiency of assembly lines and the speed of sorties, now it contained schedules for the school lathe, the name of the miller whose wheel needed repair, the account of a child whose fever had been cut by a newly installed sterilizer. There were awkward silences, too. A man who could not bring himself to talk about his son, who had been a pilot. A woman who avoided the river where her husband had gone missing. But even the silences were shared, and therefore less solitary. Pavel, who had once sketched flight plans, began to teach apprentices how to draw parts that did not imply flight. He explained tolerances with metaphors borrowed from knitting and cooking. He taught how a bearing could be as small and necessary as a button. His hands grew calmer as his diagrams multiplied in the hands of young students who asked questions not about target ranges, but about durability and cost. In their answers lay a slow conversion. The factory's intelligence, once dedicated to one logic, was being apprenticed to another. One afternoon, a child from the outskirts came with a question that had no manufacturing solution. What to do with when a neighbor's grief overflowed and they could not lift a planked floor they had no help to carry. The apprentices, who had once been taught to measure stress tolerances, learned in that moment to lift boards and to hold shoulders with a gentleness not required by blueprints. They discovered that their craft had a social license as well as a technical one. The town's work had always had politics. Now it learned the softer politics of obligation. Yet under all this, a careful worry persisted. Technology, they had learned, was indifferent until intention said it.
The town could choose how to align intention. It could not, with a stroke, change the nature of human appetite. So the factory remained a site of vigilance, of meetings, of watchfulness, of decisions made at kitchen tables as much as in offices. It was not a moral clean slate. It was a field of choices where people were learning, slowly and often clumsily, how to plant different seeds. As the season shifted, Mikhail found himself standing once again at the freight platform with Lena at his side. A shipment was being prepared, not for the front, but for a cluster of clinics inland. Crates were small and stamped with a new insignia, a cog and a sheaf. Workers loaded pumps and cast housings into the cars with the same practiced care they'd given to wings years before. And the rhythm of the rivets sounded to Mikhail like a language newly spoken. He felt a reserve of sorrow for what the rivets had once held, but also a steadier gratitude for what they now did. Beyond them, the town carried on its modest commerce. Children ran between cleared shell pits that had been made into gardens. The old pilot, Simeon, took Kolya down to the river and taught him how to skip stones. In the arc of each flat pebble, there was a small geometry of letting go. Pavel's drawings filled the shelves. The apprentices learned, by touch and by argument, the ethical curriculum of their craft. No one pretended the past had been erased. The
plates on the memorial in the square still bore names that caused a hush. The factory's gates still kept a shadow. But in the seams of ordinary days, the town was stitching another pattern, one not confident in its perfection, but committed to repair. A message arrived one dusk that made people move again with something like urgency. It was an invitation from a neighboring town. Could the factory send a team to teach a small class in metalwork, to show them how to repair pumps and how to convert an engine into a press? The letter asked for more than mere parts. It asked for the expertise to make things hold. It was a request that asked the factory to be a teacher as well as a maker. They would answer, but not yet. First, they would decide who would go, what would be taught, and how to guard against old temptations. They would need to choose what to take with them and what to leave behind. They would, in short, do what the town had now learned to do: measure, debate, and then act, with the measure of care they had given to every rivet. Mikhail folded the reply and gave it to Lena to read. She looked up, and for a moment their faces reflected the long work before them. Not a war to be won or a machine to be tuned, but the ongoing, patient labor of aligning skill to life. Outside, a train passed, bearing municipal cranes and street lamps toward a town that would soon be lit in another way. The light on the platform shifted. People in the yard put down their tools and, one by one, walked toward their small duties, toward a life remade in the shadow of what they had once made for darker ends. They had no illusions about perfection. They had, increasingly, the conviction that to make was also to choose, and that choice, exercised again and again in small acts, might yet rewrite the ledger of their legacy. The machines waited, as machines always do, indifferent to the goodness of those who guided them. It was the hands and the minds that mattered. They were learning, and learning together, the measure of that truth. They set a day for the meeting. Word moved through the town the way practical things always moved here now, first by a few knocking on doors, then by the slow current of conversation that gathered at the bakery and at the wash trough. At dusk, the bell above the forge sung once, and people came. The apprentices, Pavel with a portfolio under his arm, Semyon with Kolya yawning against his chest, the women who kept the accounts of who ate and who worked, an old teacher who had once kept school under the elm and who now kept records of hours and pay. Lena took the chair because she had the ledger and because people trusted the steadiness of her voice. Mikhail did not speak first. He watched faces the way a foreman watched metal, and to see where the heat gathered and where it had not yet reached.
The room smelled of peat and grease and the faint breath of drying clay from pots on a windowsill. Outside, the street lamps being loaded for the neighboring town glowed like promises. Inside, conversation began as it always did, soft, careful, then sharpened toward particulars. "We will not teach only how to make," Lena said finally. "We will teach how to hold what we make." Her hands found the ledger, and she tapped a line she had written the night before. What to bring, what to refuse, who will go, what to leave at home. An apprentice, Ilya, whose gloves were always streaked with solder, raised his voice. "We can teach them to turn an engine into a press. We can show them how to mend a pump. That will save lives. Why question that?" His eagerness had the clear edge of youth. It pressed at old wounds like a hand at a scab. Simeon answered simply, "Because the thing we teach can be used as it was used before. Because we learned its shape by being burned." He did not accuse, he named. The silence that followed was as necessary as any instruction. They made rules. They wrote them on a sheet of oiled paper that Pavel fastened into a small codex, pages cut from the margins of old ledgers, stitched with twine, and rubbed with oil until the words would not smudge in rain. The rules were not many, and they were not clever. They were, instead, ironed out like a seam, clear, practical, repeatable. 1. Teach the repair of pumps and presses, not the manufacture of munitions parts. 2. Bring tools that cannot be easily reconfigured into weapons, the simpler, the safer. 3. Insist upon a public ledger in the host town, kept by 3 persons of different households. 4. Train at least 2 apprentices from the host town for every one we send. 5. Speak plainly about past harms. Let the learners know why certain paths are closed. Mikhail listened as the rules were proposed. When his turn came, he said, "We will also teach how to refuse." It sounded like an odd subject to call out in a room of makers, but he meant it utterly. We will teach how to say no without shaming the neighbor, how to measure a contract, and to refuse a coin that wants a different heart. There were practical debates: who would go, which tools to seal in a crate, whether to take the lathe or instead take templates for making a press without too much metallurgy. Some argued for the lathe, others for a set of blocks and jigs that would allow work with less heat and fewer dangerous materials. Lena insisted on taking a kit of instruments for testing metal, simple things, a file, a set of weights. The instruments were less glamorous than the lathe, but they were a teacher's a way to say, "This metal will hold, this will not." They chose 3 to go. Mikhail, because he had the necessary knowledge and because the town trusted him to speak plainly. Ilya, for his hands and for the need to temper his eagerness into prudence. And Anya, a quiet woman who had once been a seamstress and now kept the factory's patterns, because she had a sense for small tolerances and for how to arrange a workshop so that things were visible and not hidden from oversight. Lena would stay to run the yard and to keep a watchful countenance over the factory's inventory. Pavel insisted on going to make drawings and diagrams that would travel with the team, visual contracts. Simeon would not leave. His old bones held him to the river and to Koya, but he came to the platform to see them off, carrying bread wrapped in cloth. The town gathered to pack. It was a ceremony of choices. They wrapped tools in cloths that had once been flags and in blankets that had been repurposed from uniforms. Everything bore a trace of former use. Men and women checked boxes twice and left notes sewn into seams. Instructions, warnings, the names of the people who had touched each object. Someone carved a small stamp, the cog and sheaf of their new insignia, onto the lid of the crate that contained measuring instruments. Pavel slipped a drawing into the box, a simple engraving of a pump maiden lifting water from a well. He said nothing when he placed it there. His hand trembled only a little. At dawn, the train that bore them rattled away under a sky that had the flat light of steel. Mikhail stood at the last carriage, while Lena held his arm for a moment as if to press the map of the town into him. He felt the pull of 2 towns at once. The one he left, with its new ways of doing and its memorial plates. The one he would meet, where hunger and leaky roofs might make people's eyes hungry for tools more than for rules. The journey was long and give and take of landscape. Fields that had been gardens now that summer had come, ruined bridges patched with living boards, rivers reflecting the mute industry of men and women. They spoke in measured sentences, and in the pauses between, Ilya practiced knots with his fingers, then looked at Mikhail and asked small technical questions that grew into moral ones. What if they ask for something we cannot refuse? What if a man says he will pay and he expects? He let the sentence hang. We will refuse, Mikhail said. We will make clear why. There will be no silent complicity. You refuse and you teach them to refuse too. That is the harder work. He did not offer a sermon. He offered a method. Explanation, demonstration, and the public ledger. Things that made refusal legible and therefore less likely to be met with violence. They arrived in a town that had been hollowed and replanted. Its mayor, a title they did not use here, a man who had the look of someone made brittle by responsibility, greeted them at a square that served as market. Their host was meek with gratitude. Children watched the crates unrolled and tested small gears. Women came to touch the measuring instruments as if they might become charms. Teaching was not a matter of imposing a plan. It was a process of listening, of sitting at kitchen tables to hear where pumps had failed and where a press might make a difference. The team found in that new town a similar architecture of grief and necessity. They met a blacksmith whose hands shook. He had been ordered once to make a design he could not refuse. He came to the first lesson with his face set, and for a long time would not speak of the past. Anya worked with him, showing him how a template could be adapted to make shims and braces for hospital stretchers. Ilya taught young men how to measure torque and to judge the grain of castings. Mikhail took the public ledger and, with modest hospitality, asked 3 elected households to keep it. They wrote down hours, job agreements, and any offer that involved outsiders. There were failures. A trial press bound poorly one evening and the assembly tilted under load. A bolt, too thin, sheared clean. No one was hurt, but the town's old fear flickered up as if awakened. Ilya sat with his head in his hands. He had counted on the precision of his hands to prove himself. Instead, he had to learn to slow down and to accept the failure as instruction. Mikhail, sitting beside him, said little. He had been taught by failure in other, darker ways. The language he used was small and direct. Take it slow, he said. Measure again. Whoever walks off with what they cannot afford will always be the first to blame the forge. At nights, they held open conversations in the square. People came with torches and questions. How do we keep our tools from being taken? Who counts the hours? What do we do if a traveling commissar offers work and promises coin? Mikhail answered plainly. Set up witnesses, make agreements public, refuse to build alone in silence. He spoke of the codex they had brought and read its rules in low voice. The practice of saying no in public felt like a new kind of craft to them. It required courage and a thin faith that the shame of a bad choice could be carried as a town burden rather than as an individual secret. When the team prepared to leave some weeks later, the host town pressed gifts into their hands. Jars of saved honey, cloth, a carved wooden handle for Mikhail's hammer. Men who had come with little but returned with apprentices who could keep pumps working now embraced them as if
they had been family. In the parting, Mikhail felt the tug of small satisfactions and the slow pain of uncertainty. He had seen seeds planted. He had also seen how fragile the rootings were. On the train back, as the landscape slid by like a slow argument, Mikhail thought of the memorial plates in his own town and of what Lena had said about measuring and deciding. The work of making had resumed there in small, steady currents. There would be new requests. There would be new temptations. But for the first time in many years, the factory's output was accompanied by a conversation that began in kitchens and carried to gates and to squares. The rivets were still rivets, but now each rivet had a small, deliberate pause before being set. They returned to a modest celebration,
bread and a few songs, the clapping of palms that had long ago learned, in this town, the difference between cheering and remembering. Pavel unfolded his drawings for the apprentices to study. Children crowded around to trace the ink lines with their fingers. Lena greeted them without a great show of ceremony. That was her gift, to make the extraordinary ordinary and therefore bearable. That night, after most had gone to bed, Mackay walked to the square where the memorial stood. The plates caught the moon, and the names shimmered like a gallery of small, stern judges. He ran a hand along one plate and felt the cool metal. There was no absolution in that touch, only the knowledge of cost. He kept there, in the small hour, a promise that the town's making would remain under the oversight of many hands and many stories. Machines would keep their indifference, men and women would keep their choices. He returned to his bed with a fatigue that was not only the body. The next day, the apprentices resumed their lessons, the factory's rhythm settling into a new accommodation between craft and conscience. Outside, on the platform, new crates waited to be labeled, not with only a cog and a sheaf, but with small notes sewn into the wood, names, witnesses, and a short line that each box would bear, a reminder from the codex, for life, for keeping, for the good we can stand to do together. The town was far from perfect. It was, however, practicing. And in that practice lay a fragile hope that, savoring its small repairs, they might yet reshape in the ledger of their legacy towards something like steadiness and care.